I thought she was about to ask me to stay late and help finish another project. Instead, my coworker closed the office door, looked around to make sure nobody was listening, and quietly asked, "Can you pretend to be my boyfriend for one weekend?" For a full 5 seconds, I honestly believed she was joking. Claire and I had worked together for almost 2 years. She was smart, funny, beautiful, and completely out of my league. Outside of meetings and the occasional coffee break, we barely spoke. So hearing those words come from her felt completely unreal. "I'm serious," she whispered. "I don't have anyone else to ask." There was something different about her. She wasn't embarrassed. She was scared. The kind of scared that doesn't disappear with a simple explanation. I should have asked 100 questions. Why me? Why now? Why pretend? Instead, I heard myself say, "Okay." She looked up so quickly I almost laughed. "Really? I'll help." For the first time all week, she smiled, not a big smile. Just enough to tell me I'd made the right decision. I thought I was agreeing to play the role of a fake boyfriend for 48 hours. I had no idea I was about to meet her entire family, or that her ex-boyfriend would walk through the front door before dinner, or that by Sunday night, the hardest part wouldn't be pretending we were in love, it would be pretending we weren't. Because somewhere between the long drive, the lakeside sunsets, the late-night conversations, and one unexpected dance under a sky full of stars, the line between acting and falling in love quietly disappeared. I spent the rest of Friday wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. Claire hadn't explained much, only that her cousin's engagement party was being held at her grandparents' lake house, about 3 hours outside the city. Her family thought she'd been dating someone for months. That someone was now supposed to be me. At exactly 5:30, I walked into the office parking garage carrying a small overnight bag. Claire was already waiting beside a silver SUV. She wasn't wearing her usual business clothes. Instead, she had on a light blue sweater, jeans, and white sneakers. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. For a second, she didn't look like my coworker. She looked like someone I was meeting for the first time. She smiled nervously. "You actually came," I said I would. She let out a quiet breath. "Thank you." I placed my bag in the trunk. "So, when do I get the fake boyfriend training?" She laughed. "I was wondering how long it'd take you to ask." As soon as we pulled onto the highway, she opened a small notebook from her purse. I stared at it. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is." She bit her lip. "It might be." She handed it to me. Across the front, she'd written one title. Asterisk, boyfriend cheat sheet. I couldn't help laughing. "You made notes?" I panicked. Inside were several pages. Favorite color, forest green. Favorite dessert, cheesecake. How we met company volunteer event. Dating for 8 months. First date, mini golf. Asterisk, nicknames. None at the bottom, she'd added one sentence. "Please don't let my uncle ask about football. Just smile." I laughed so hard, I nearly dropped the notebook. "This is incredible. I know, it's also incredibly embarrassing. I think it's adorable." She looked away, trying not to smile. "Don't make this harder." I thought fake boyfriends were supposed to flirt, not before we've even left the city. The next hour, we memorized our imaginary relationship. We invented favorite restaurants, inside jokes, vacation plans we'd supposedly taken. By the time we stopped for coffee, I almost believed we'd actually been dating. As we stood outside the small roadside cafe, Claire suddenly became unusually quiet. "What?" She stared across the parking lot. "My family?" She hesitated. "They're going to love you. Isn't that the goal?" She slowly shook her head. "No, that's what scares me." Before I could ask why, she changed the subject. "You take your coffee with one sugar, right?" I blinked. "You remembered?" She smiled. "You've ordered the same thing every morning for almost 2 years." That surprised me. I always assumed she barely noticed me outside work. Apparently, she had. The drive became easier after that. The awkwardness slowly disappeared. We talked about childhood memories, terrible first jobs, embarrassing high school stories. At one point, she laughed so hard at one of my stories that she had tears in her eyes. "You know," she said between laughs, "you're completely different outside the office." "So are you, really? At work, you're always serious. And now, you actually smile." She looked out the passenger window. I forgot how much I liked smiling. The sentence stayed with me for miles. Late that afternoon, we turned onto a narrow road lined with tall pine trees. The lake came into view. Sunlight shimmered across the water. A beautiful white house stood near the shoreline, surrounded by family members setting up decorations. Cars filled the driveway. Children ran across the grass. Music drifted through the open windows. Claire quietly reached over and took my hand. I looked at her. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her fingers were trembling. "They're all watching." I gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do this alone." She looked into my eyes for a brief second, then whispered, "I'm not pretending about being glad you're here." Before I could respond, The front door opened. A cheerful older woman hurried down the porch steps. Oh my goodness. She threw her arms around Claire, then turned to me with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. So, you must be Ethan. Before I could answer, a man's voice came from behind us, cold, confident, and completely unexpected. I didn't realize Claire had replaced me so quickly. Claire's hand tightened around mine. Without turning around, she whispered just two words. He's here. Claire's fingers tightened around mine so suddenly that I instinctively looked at her instead of turning around. Her smile had vanished. The color had drained from her face. For a second, she looked like she wanted to get back in the car and drive away. He's here. I slowly turned around. A tall man in his early 30s stood near the porch steps, with one hand casually tucked into his jacket pocket. Well-dressed, confident, the kind of confidence that seemed practiced. He smiled, but there wasn't any warmth behind it. Claire. He nodded politely before looking at me. And you must be Ethan. I held out my hand. Ethan Carter. He shook it. His grip was firmer than necessary. Ryan. For a brief second, neither of us let go. Then he smiled, so he glanced toward Claire. I guess you've moved on. Claire stepped slightly closer to me. Ryan, my family's waiting. He raised both hands innocently. I'm just saying hello. His tone was calm, almost friendly, but something about it made me uneasy. I'd only known Claire outside the office for a few hours, yet I could already tell this wasn't the same fear she'd shown before an important meeting or a difficult conversation. This was different. This was someone she'd spent a long time trying not to think about. Thankfully, her grandmother interrupted before the moment became even more uncomfortable. There you all are. She walked down the porch with surprising energy. Claire immediately hugged her. Grandma! Oh, sweetheart! She held Claire's face in both hands. You look happy. For a split second, I noticed Claire glance toward me, then she smiled. I think I am. Her grandmother turned toward me. And you must be Ethan. I nodded politely. It's so nice to finally meet you. She hugged me before I had time to react. I'm Margaret. If Claire brought you here, then you're already family this weekend. I laughed. I'll try not to disappoint. Oh, nonsense. She smiled warmly. Anyone who survives our family barbecue deserves a medal. Within minutes, I was being introduced to parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, children whose names I immediately forgot, and at least three different dogs. Everyone welcomed me like I'd been part of the family for years. The strangest part, it didn't feel fake. Claire walked beside me the entire time. Sometimes our shoulders touched. Sometimes she'd quietly explain who someone was before introducing me. Without thinking, she'd occasionally smile at me the way people smile at someone they're genuinely comfortable with. The act was becoming surprisingly easy, almost too easy. Later that afternoon, everyone gathered near the lake for photos. Claire's cousin called out. Couples, Claire looked at me. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be. We walked toward the dock. The photographer grinned, a little closer. Claire slipped her arm around mine. I placed my hand gently against her back. Neither of us spoke. The photographer looked through the camera. Perfect. Then he laughed. Now look at each other instead of the camera. Claire slowly turned toward me. Our eyes met. For one unexpected second, everything else disappeared. The lake, the people, the pretending. She smiled. Not the practiced smile she'd been wearing all afternoon, a real one. The photographer lowered his camera. Don't move. He took another picture, then another. Finally, he smiled to himself. Those are the easiest engagement photos I've ever taken. Claire and I both laughed awkwardly. We're not engaged, she said. Not yet, her uncle shouted from across the lawn. The entire family burst into laughter. Claire hid her face against my shoulder. I am never recovering from this. I laughed. I think you're doing great. She looked up at me. So are you? For a brief moment, neither of us stepped away, until a slow clap echoed from behind us. We turned. Ryan stood near the end of the dock, still smiling, still watching. He walked toward us slowly. I have to admit, he looked directly at me. You two are very convincing. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. But be careful, Ethan. His smile never faded. Claire has a habit of hiding the hardest parts of the truth. Before I could respond, he walked away, leaving one question echoing through my mind. What truth was Claire still hiding from me? Ryan's words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Asterisk, Claire has a habit of hiding the hardest parts of the truth. I kept telling myself not to think about it. Maybe he was just trying to get under my skin. Maybe this was exactly why Claire had asked me to come. Still, the way she'd looked when she first saw him told me one thing. Whatever had happened between them, it hadn't ended peacefully. By sunset, the backyard had transformed into a celebrations. Sting lights hung between the trees. Music drifted across the lake. Children chased each other along the dock, while everyone else gathered around long wooden tables covered with homemade food. Claire seemed different around her family lighter. She laughed more. She teased her cousins. She helped her grandmother carry desserts into the dining room. Watching her, it was hard to imagine this was the same woman who spent most lunch breaks quietly eating at her desk. She caught me looking. What? I smiled. I think your family brings out a different version of you. She laughed softly. They remind me who I used to be. And who was that? She thought for a moment. Someone who laughed without thinking about it first. The answer made my chest tighten. Before I could respond, her little cousin Emma ran over and grabbed my hand. Ethan. I looked down. She couldn't have been older than 8. You have to help us. Help with what? The lanterns. She pointed toward the dock where everyone was writing wishes on floating paper lanterns. It's our family tradition, Claire smiled. Every engagement party, wedding, or big celebration, everyone writes one wish. They don't have to tell anyone what they wrote. They just let it go. Emma tugged on my sleeve. Come on! Within minutes, Claire and I were sitting side by side on the dock with blank cards in front of us. What are you writing? I smiled. If I told you, it wouldn't work. She rolled her eyes. That's not how wishes work. Maybe it is, she laughed. You really are impossible. I finished writing first and folded my card. Claire took longer, much longer. She stared at the paper as if choosing every word carefully. Finally, she folded hers too. As the sky turned orange, everyone gathered near the water. One by one, the lanterns floated into the evening sky. Emma clapped excitedly. They're beautiful. They really were. Dozens of tiny lights slowly drifting over the lake. Claire stood beside me quietly, watching them disappear into the distance. Without thinking, she reached for my hand. This time, it wasn't because people were watching. She simply held it. Neither of us mentioned it. Neither of us let go. After several moments, she spoke so quietly I almost missed it. I forgot what peace feels like. I looked at her. You deserve more of it. She smiled. I hope you're right. The music behind us grew louder as everyone returned toward the house. Only Claire and I remained near the dock. For the first time all day, we were completely alone. She looked out across the lake. You know, I almost canceled this trip. Why? I was afraid of Ryan? She nodded. But mostly, she hesitated, of pretending to be happy. I frowned. You don't have to pretend with me. She looked into my eyes. I know. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt surprisingly comfortable, then footstep echoed across the wooden dock behind us. Ryan. He stopped a few feet away. I was wondering if I could borrow Ethan for a minute. Claire immediately looked uneasy. Why? He kept his eyes on me. Just a conversation. She looked at me. You don't have to. I gently squeezed her hand. It's okay. She reluctantly nodded. I'll be inside. Once she disappeared toward the house, Ryan leaned against the dock railing for nearly a minute. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. You seem like a decent guy. I try to be. He nodded. Then I'm going to tell you something nobody else here knows. I folded my arms. I'm listening. He stared across the dark lake. This weekend isn't really about fooling her family. My heartbeat slowed. What do you mean? He looked directly at me. Claire didn't bring you here because she needed a fake boyfriend. He paused. His expression became unexpectedly serious. She brought you here because she's planning to tell her family something tomorrow morning, and she's terrified they'll never look at her the same way again. Ryan's words echoed in my head long after he walked away. Asterisk. She's planning to tell her family something tomorrow morning, and she's terrified they'll never look at her the same way again. I stood alone on the dock, staring across the lake. Part of me wanted to believe he was lying, trying to create doubt, trying to ruin whatever Claire and I had built over the last 24 hours. But another part, the part that remembered how nervous she'd been before we arrived, wondered if he was telling the truth. When I walked back toward the house, laughter spilled through the open windows. Music played softly. Someone was teaching Emma how to dance in the living room. Claire was helping her grandmother wash dishes in the kitchen. She looked up the moment I walked in. There you are. She studied my face for a second. What did he want? I forced a small smile. Nothing important. She didn't believe me. I could tell, but she also didn't ask again. Instead, she quietly said, Come with me. She led me through the back door onto a small wooden porch overlooking the lake. The party noises faded behind us. Only crickets and gentle waves filled the silence. She leaned against the railing. I'm sorry. For what? For putting you in the middle of all this. I shook my head. You didn't force me to come. I know. She smiled sadly. But I still feel guilty. I looked at her for a moment. Ryan said something. Her shoulders immediately stiffened. What did he tell you? He said, I chose my words carefully, that tomorrow isn't really about introducing your boyfriend. She closed her eyes. He shouldn't have said anything. So it's true? She nodded slowly. Yes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered. I've been lying to my family. I frowned. Lying how? They think I left my old life because I got a better job. She looked down at the wooden floor. They don't know I spent almost a year seeing a therapist. My heart tightened. They don't know, she swallowed, that after Ryan and I broke up, I had panic attacks. The words barely escaped her lips. I couldn't drive. I couldn't sleep. I'd hear my phone ring and my heart would start racing. She laughed bitterly. I used to sit in my office bathroom pretending I was fine. I remembered something. Every few weeks, Claire would suddenly disappear from work for 10 or 15 minutes. I always assumed she would take a break. Now, everything made sense. I became really good at smiling. She looked at me. You've seen that version of me. I slowly nodded. Everyone at work has. They think I'm confident. She gave a heartbreaking smile. I've just become really good at hiding. The porch fell silent. Then she looked out across the dark lake. My therapist told me something 6 months ago. What? Healing starts the day you stop performing wellness for everyone else. She laughed quietly. I've repeated that sentence 100 times. But tomorrow, she looked back at the house where her family was laughing together. I'll have to live it. I finally understood. She hadn't invited me because she needed someone to fool her family. She'd invited me because she needed one person who already knew the truth, standing beside her while she told everyone else. I stepped a little closer. Claire, she looked at me. You don't have to be fearless tomorrow. I don't? I slowly shook my head. You just have to be honest. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. You make everything sound so simple. It isn't simple, it's brave. She smiled through watery eyes. I don't feel brave. I smiled gently. I think brave people rarely do. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then, without warning, she wrapped her arms around me, not because anyone was watching, not because we were pretending, just because she needed someone to remind her she wasn't facing tomorrow alone. I hugged her back, quickly, carefully. When she finally stepped away, she whispered, "Thank you for coming." I smiled. I think I needed this weekend too. She laughed softly. I had a feeling before either of us could say another word. The screen door behind us slid open. Claire's grandmother stepped onto the porch. She looked at us, then smiled knowingly. I've been looking everywhere for you two. Claire quickly wiped her eyes. Everything okay, Grandma? Margaret nodded. More than okay. She looked directly at me. Ethan, I was hoping we could talk. Just the two of us. Claire's smile immediately faded because whatever her grandmother wanted to say, she clearly didn't want Claire to hear it. Claire looked at her grandmother, then at me. A flicker of worry crossed her face. Grandma, Margaret smiled warmly. I'm not stealing him forever. She gently squeezed Claire's hand. I just need 5 minutes. Claire glanced at me. You don't have to. I smiled reassuringly. It's okay. She nodded, though I could tell she was nervous. As Claire disappeared back into the house, Margaret motioned toward the old wooden dock. Would you walk with me? The evening air had turned cool. We walked slowly along the shoreline in silence. For a while, she simply watched the water. Finally, she spoke. Claire hasn't laughed like that in years. I looked toward the house where Claire was helping her little cousins roast marshmallows over a fire pit. She has a beautiful laugh. Margaret smiled. She does. We were afraid we'd never hear it again. Her words caught me off guard. We? The whole family. She folded her hands together. We knew something had changed after Ryan. You did? She nodded. Not everything, but enough she stopped visiting, stopped answering calls, stopped celebrating birthdays. When she finally came home, Margaret's voice softened. She looked like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. I felt my chest tighten. She never told me that. She doesn't tell anyone. Margaret smiled sadly. Claire has always believed protecting other people means carrying everything herself. We stopped at the end of the dock. The lake reflected hundreds of tiny stars. Margaret turned toward me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you really her boyfriend? The question hung between us. I had promised Claire I would keep pretending, but somehow, lying to her grandmother didn't feel right anymore. I took a slow breath. No. Margaret smiled. I thought so. I blinked. You knew? The second I watched you two together. My heart sank. I'm sorry, she laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart. You were convincing, but not because you're good actors. I frowned. Then why? She looked toward the fire pit where Claire was laughing with Emma. Because every time Claire looked at you, she forgot she was pretending. I didn't know what to say, Margaret continued. And every time you looked at Claire, you watched her the way people watch someone they're quietly falling in love with. The words hit me harder than I expected. Was it really that obvious? She smiled gently. I'm 81 years old. I've watched people fall in love for a very long time. I recognize it. I looked down at the water. I don't even know when it happened. Margaret laughed. Nobody ever does. Silence settled between us again. Then her expression became more serious. Ethan, I'm going to tell you something Claire would never tell you herself. I looked up. When Ryan left, Claire blamed herself. She believed if she'd been more patient, more understanding, more perfect, he would have loved her differently. I shook my head. That's not true. I know. Margaret smiled sadly, but broken hearts rarely believe the truth. She reached into her sweater pocket, pulled out a small folded photograph. It showed Claire standing on this very dock several years earlier. She was smiling beside Ryan, but something immediately caught my attention. It wasn't Claire, it was her eyes. They weren't happy. They looked careful, almost afraid. Margaret noticed me staring. You see it? I nodded. I do. I didn't notice it then. She sighed. A long silence followed. Finally, she placed the photograph back into her pocket. I don't care whether you and Claire are pretending. She smiled warmly. I only care that she's smiling again. She looked directly into my eyes, and that's because of you. Before I could answer, Emma came running toward us across the dock. Ethan, she was completely out of breath. You have to come. What happened? She grabbed my hand. It's Claire. My heart immediately started racing. What about Claire? Emma looked frightened. She's gone. I frowned. Gone where? Emma pointed toward the driveway. I heard Ryan tell her, we need to talk one last time. Then she whispered the words that made my blood run cold, and they just drove away together. For a second, I couldn't move. Emma's words echoed in my head. If they just drove away together. Every terrible possibility rushed through my mind at once. Which way did they go? Emma pointed toward the road leading around the lake. They weren't yelling. They were just talking. Margaret gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Ethan. I looked at her. Don't assume the worst. I nodded, but my heart was already racing. Without another word, I grabbed my truck keys from the porch table and drove toward the only road that circled the lake. The sun had almost disappeared. Shadows stretched across the empty road. For nearly 10 minutes, there was nothing. No cars, no headlights. No sign of Claire. Then, I spotted Ryan's SUV parked beside an old wooden pier overlooking the water. I pulled over several yards away. I didn't rush toward them. Instead, I walked quietly. Claire and Ryan were sitting on opposite ends of a weathered picnic table. Several feet apart, neither of them looked angry. They looked finished. Ryan noticed me first. He gave a small nod. I figured you'd come. Claire immediately stood. Ethan. I looked at her. Are you okay? She smiled softly. I am. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Ryan quietly stood as well. I'll give you two a minute. Before walking away, he stopped beside me. I wasn't trying to steal her from you. He looked toward Claire. I was trying to give her something back. He handed me a thin brown envelope. For her. Then he walked toward his SUV without another word. Within seconds, he was gone. Only the sound of the lake remained. Claire stared at the envelope. I know what that is. You do, she nodded. My journals. I frowned. What journals? The ones I left behind when I moved out. She slowly sat back on the bench. I thought he'd thrown them away. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside were three worn notebooks tied together with a faded ribbon. She laughed quietly. I filled these with dreams. What kind of dreams? The places I wanted to travel. The little bakery I wanted to open someday. The novels I wanted to write. She smiled sadly. I stopped writing after we started dating. I looked at her. Why? She shrugged gently. I convinced myself growing up meant giving those dreams away. She opened the first notebook. Pressed between two pages was a tiny dried sunflower. She stared at it for several seconds. I forgot about this. What is it? The first flower I ever pressed. I was 16. I wrote underneath it. She turned the notebook so I could read. Promise yourself you'll never become someone you don't recognize. The words hit both of us at the same time. She laughed through tears. I broke that promise. I gently shook my head. No. She looked at me. You lost yourself for a while. That's different. The breeze carried the scent of pine across the lake. Claire closed the notebook. You know what Ryan said before you arrived? What? He apologized. I waited for the first time, without asking for anything in return. She smiled softly. He said returning these journals was the only decent thing he still knew how to do. I looked toward the empty road where his SUV had disappeared. Some endings didn't need revenge. They just needed accountability. Claire took one of the notebooks and handed it to me. Read the first page. I opened it carefully. The handwriting looked younger, messier, more hopeful. The very first sentence read, someday I'll find someone who makes me feel safe enough to become completely myself. Asterisk, I looked up. Claire's eyes met mine. She smiled through tears. I spent years looking for that person. She paused, without realizing he'd been sitting across from me at work almost every morning. Before I could answer, she slowly reached for my hand. This time, neither of us was pretending. Neither of us needed a reason. She intertwined her fingers with mine, looked out across the lake, then quietly whispered something that changed everything. Ethan, I don't want this weekend to be the only real thing we ever have. And for the first time since she asked me to be her fake boyfriend, there was nothing fake left between us. Neither of us spoke on the drive back to the lake house. We didn't need to. Claire's hand rested quietly in mine across the center console. Not because we were pretending anymore, because letting go suddenly felt impossible. The evening sky had turned deep blue by the time we pulled into the driveway. The engagement party was still going. Music drifted across the lawn. Children chased fireflies near the dock. Laughter echoed from the backyard. Claire looked at me before getting out of the car. So? She smiled nervously. I guess we're going back as I laughed. Honestly, don't know anymore. She looked down. Me neither. For a second, neither of us reached for the door handle, then she quietly asked, would it be okay if we didn't pretend tonight? I smiled. Her cheeks turned slightly pink. She laughed softly. I was hoping you'd say that. We walked toward the backyard together, not rehearsing stories, not remembering fake details, just walking. As ourselves, the first person to notice us was Emma. She came running across the grass. There you are. She stopped in front of us, looked at our hands, then smiled so widely it almost made me laugh. I knew it, Claire raised an eyebrow. Knew what? Emma folded her arms proudly. You stopped acting. The innocence of the comment caught both of us off guard. Claire looked at me, then burst into laughter. I guess kids really do notice everything. They always have, I said. A few moments later, Margaret walked over, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She looked from Claire to me, to our hands, then smiled knowingly. I was wondering how long it would take. Claire laughed. Were we really that obvious? Margaret nodded. Only to everyone over the age of 70. The three of us laughed together, for the first time that weekend. There was no awkwardness, no pretending. As the evening continued, people gathered around the fire pit. Someone brought out an old guitar. Claire sat beside me on a wooden bench. Our shoulders touched. Nobody questioned it. Nobody whispered. Nobody stared. It simply felt right. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone inside, Claire and I walked down to the dock one last time. The lake was perfectly still. Moonlight reflected across the water. She looked out toward the horizon. You know what? I spent weeks planning how to fake this relationship. I smiled. I remember the notebook. She laughed. The notebook, I had backup stories, emergency conversation topics, fake anniversary dates. I shook my head. You were very organized. I was terrified. She turned toward me. And then, none of it mattered. No, it didn't. She looked down at the water. I think the strangest part is, I trusted you before I even understood why. I thought back to Friday afternoon, to the office, to the moment she'd quietly asked me to pretend to be her boyfriend. You know what I realized today? She looked at me. What? You never asked me because I was the easiest choice. She frowned slightly. I wasn't? I smiled. You asked me because I was the safest one. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. I didn't even realize that. I think you did. You just couldn't explain it yet. For a long moment, she simply looked at me, then she whispered, Ethan, I don't want to go back to being coworkers who only talk during meetings. I laughed softly. I was hoping you'd say that. She smiled. But, what? We still work together. People are going to ask questions. They will, she sighed dramatically. The office gossip is going to be unbearable. I can survive gossip. She laughed. I know. Then her expression became more serious. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the small notebook she'd made before the trip, the asterisk boyfriend cheat sheet. She smiled as she flipped through the pages. Our fake first date, our fake favorite restaurant, our fake inside jokes. She looked up at me. I guess we don't need these anymore. Before I could answer, she slowly tore the pages out one by one, not because she was embarrassed, because none of them were true anymore. The wind carried the pieces toward the lake. She kept only one blank page, handed it to me, along with a pen. What do I write? She smiled. Our real first date. I looked at the blank page, then at her. I have an idea. She raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I smiled. Next Friday. No pretending, no fake stories, no family watching, just dinner. She smiled so brightly that it took my breath away. I'd really like that. Before either of us could say another word, my phone buzzed. It was a message from our manager. Reminder. Monday morning leadership meeting. Everyone must attend. Claire looked at the screen. Then back at me, she laughed. Reality starts in less than 48 hours. I smiled. Maybe. But I looked into her eyes. Monday is going to be the beginning of something. Neither of us realized. Monday morning would test our relationship far more than pretending ever had. Monday morning didn't end the way either of us expected. It only made everything more complicated. For the next 3 days, Claire and I tried to act like nothing had changed. At work, we attended meetings, answered emails, grabbed coffee, talked about deadlines. From the outside, we looked exactly the same, but every quiet glance across the conference room, every smile in the hallway, every accidental touch while reaching for the same folder, reminded us that nothing was the same anymore. The hardest part wasn't pretending to be coworkers, it was pretending the weekend had stayed at the lake. By Wednesday afternoon, I noticed something strange. Claire was cleaning her desk, not organizing it, packing it. Her favorite coffee mug was gone. The small cactus she'd kept beside her monitor had disappeared. Even the framed photo of her grandmother and little cousin Emma wasn't there anymore. My stomach tightened. I walked over. Claire? She looked up. Oh, hey, what are you doing? She hesitated, then forced a smile. Just cleaning. I looked at the half-empty desk. This isn't cleaning. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Finally, she reached into her drawer and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It was an internal company form, department transfer request. I looked back at her. You're leaving? She nodded slowly. The Seattle office. My heart sank. When? If everything gets approved, next Friday, only 9 days away. Why didn't you tell me? She looked down. Because I knew you'd try to stop me. I would. I know. Silence filled the office. People walked past us without realizing my entire week had just fallen apart. Claire folded her arms. This was the plan before the lake. What changed? She looked into my eyes. You. The answer hurt more than I expected. I don't understand, she sighed. I accepted the transfer because I wanted a fresh start, a different city, a different life. A place where nobody knew the version of me that spent years pretending to be okay. She smiled sadly. Then I met the real version of us. She glanced toward the office windows. And now, I don't know what the right decision is anymore. I stepped closer. Then don't leave because you're afraid. I'm not afraid. Then why are you going? She laughed quietly. Because I'm terrified that if this doesn't work, I'll lose the best job I've ever had and the best person I've met in years. Her honesty caught me completely off guard. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then our manager, David, appeared beside us. There you are. He looked between us. The executive team approved the transfer. My heart dropped. David smiled at Claire. Congratulations. We'll miss you. He handed her an envelope. Your official paperwork. After he walked away, Claire stared at the envelope in silence. I guess that's my answer. She picked up the last box from her desk, not a moving box. Just one small cardboard box holding the pieces of her office life. She looked at me. I should probably finish packing. Then she walked away. I stood there watching her disappear around the corner. For the second time in 2 weekends, I found myself staring at someone walking away, knowing I couldn't let it become goodbye, because this time, there wasn't a fake relationship to save. There was a real one. Monday morning arrived much faster than either of us wanted. The drive back to the city was quiet. Not uncomfortable, just different. The weekend had changed something neither of us knew how to describe. When we reached the office parking garage, Claire turned off the engine but didn't move. She looked through the windshield for a long moment. I guess this is where real life starts again. I smiled. Maybe. She looked at me. What if everything feels different now? I laughed softly. I think that's because it is. She smiled, then took a deep breath. So, we walk in together? I thought about it. If that's what you want. She nodded. It is. For the first time, there was no pretending behind the answer. We walked into the office side by side. Within seconds, every head turned, not dramatically, just enough to notice. People smiled, a few whispered. One coworker nearly dropped his coffee. Claire leaned closer. I told you, the gossip. I can hear it already. I smiled, let them wonder. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside. Only one other person joined us. Our manager did. He looked from Claire to me, then smiled. So I finally know why both of you suddenly requested Friday afternoon off. Claire's eyes widened. You approved both requests? He nodded. I assumed it was team building. I couldn't help laughing. In a way, it was. David smiled. Whatever happened? Claire. She looked up. You look happier. The elevator became quiet. Claire smiled politely. Thank you. When the doors opened, David walked away toward the conference room. Claire looked at me. You know, I don't think anyone's ever said that to me at work before. They probably noticed. What? You finally stopped pretending. The words stayed with her. The morning leadership meeting passed in a blur, every few minutes. I'd catch Claire looking at me. Every time our eyes met, she smiled, the same smile she'd worn on the dock. By lunchtime, the rumors had spread through half the office. One coworker stopped beside my desk. So, you and Claire? I smiled. We're getting coffee, he laughed. That's not what I asked. It was the only answer you were getting. Across the room, Claire looked up and caught my eye. She couldn't stop smiling. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed, a message from Claire. Meet me on the rooftop after work. No explanations, no emoji, just one sentence. At exactly 6 o'clock, I stepped onto the rooftop terrace. The city glowed beneath the setting sun. Claire was already there. She was leaning against the railing with two takeaway coffees. You remembered. One sugar. She handed me the cup. I've remembered for 2 years. For several minutes, we simply watched the skyline, then she reached into her purse. Pulled out the old asterisk boyfriend cheat sheet. I laughed. I thought you threw it away. I kept one page. She unfolded it. Every fake detail was crossed out. Only one blank space remained at the bottom. She handed me a pen. Remember what you wrote on the doc? Our real first date? I nodded. She smiled. Write it. I looked at the empty line, then slowly wrote, Friday, 7 p.m. Luigi's Italian restaurant. No pretending. She stared at it for a second, then folded the paper, carefully placed it back into her purse. This one, she smiled. I'm keeping. I looked at her. So, is this still fake? She laughed. I don't think it ever was. The wind moved gently across the rooftop. She stepped closer. Not because she needed courage, because she wanted to. She slipped her hand into mine. I've spent so much of my life wondering what love was supposed to feel like. She looked into my eyes. I always thought it'd be dramatic. She smiled softly. But maybe it's just finding the one person who makes you feel completely safe to be yourself. I gently squeezed her hand. I think that's exactly what it is. She rested her head against my shoulder. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the skyline. Neither of us spoke. Because for the first time since she'd walked into my office asking for a fake relationship, there was nothing left to pretend. Only two coworkers, standing on a rooftop, quietly looking forward to their very first real date. Friday evening arrived faster than either of us expected. At exactly 7 o'clock, I was standing outside Luigi's Italian restaurant holding a small bouquet of white daisies, not roses. Claire had once mentioned during our fake road trip that roses always felt too formal. But daisies, she'd smiled. They look like they're happy just to exist. So, I bought daisies. A minute later, she walked around the corner. She wasn't wearing office clothes, no laptop bag, no company badge, just a simple cream-colored dress, white sneakers, and the same smile that had quietly become my favorite part of every day. When she saw the flowers, she stopped walking. You remembered. I remember more than you think. She accepted the bouquet carefully. I've never had someone bring me daisies. I smiled. I wanted our first real date to feel different. She looked at the flowers again. It already does. Dinner lasted almost 3 hours, not because the food was slow, because neither of us wanted the evening to end. For the first time, there were no fake stories, no rehearsed answers, no pretending. We talked about childhood dreams, books we'd never finished, places we still wanted to visit. She admitted she still wanted to open the little bakery she'd written about years ago. I admitted I'd secretly wanted to write children's books. She laughed. I never would have guessed. I don't tell many people. You can tell me. Somehow those 4 words meant more than either of us expected. As we walked through the city afterward, it began to rain. A light summer rain. People hurried beneath awnings. Cars splashed through puddles. Claire looked up at the sky and laughed. We forgot umbrellas. I think we're officially terrible at planning. She smiled mischievously. Or maybe we're getting better at enjoying unplanned things. We kept walking. Neither of us cared that we were getting soaked. Eventually, we reached a small pedestrian bridge overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered across the water. Claire rested her elbows on the railing. You know, what? If I hadn't asked you to pretend, we probably would have spent another 2 years saying good morning in the office, and nothing else. I nodded. Probably. She smiled. That would have been a shame. It would have. She looked down at the river for a long moment, then quietly asked, Ethan, when did you stop pretending? I thought about it. The truth? She nodded. I think it happened when you reached for my hand on the dock. She smiled softly. I stopped pretending before that. When? The moment you said yes in your office. I looked at her. You hadn't even explained why. I know. She laughed quietly. That's when I realized the safest person I'd ever met was sitting 3 desks away from me. My heart felt impossibly full. I stepped a little closer. So this is our first real date. It is. Can I finally do something I've wanted to do all weekend? She smiled. I was wondering how long it'd take. I gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, then I kissed her softly, slowly, not because the moment was perfect, because it was real. When we finally pulled away, she rested her forehead against mine and laughed. I can't believe our entire relationship started with a lie. I smiled. I don't think it did. She raised an eyebrow. No? I slowly shook my head. The fake relationship was the lie. But every time you smiled, Every late night conversation, every laugh, every moment we looked after each other, those were real from the very beginning. A tear rolled gently down her cheek. She smiled through it. I love that answer. 1 year later, the same lake house was filled with family once again, this time, not for an engagement party, for a wedding. Emma, now a little taller, ran across the lawn carrying a small basket of flower petals. She stopped in front of me. You know, what? I always knew you weren't pretending. I laughed. How? She shrugged proudly. Because Claire smiled differently when she looked at you. Across the garden, Claire stood beneath a white wooden arch overlooking the lake. The evening breeze moved gently through her hair. She looked exactly the way I'd imagined happiness would look. As I reached her, she whispered, Do you remember the notebook, the boyfriend cheat sheet? I laughed. How could I forget? She reached into her bouquet and pulled out one folded piece of paper. The very last page, the only blank page we'd kept, she unfolded it. Beneath the words, asterisk, our real final line, best decision I ever pretended to make. I laughed through tears. So, I asked softly. No more pretending? She smiled. Never again. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the lake, I realized something. Sometimes love doesn't begin with fireworks or grand romantic speeches. Sometimes it begins with one unexpected question in a quiet office. Would you pretend to be my boyfriend for one weekend? Neither of us could have imagined where that question would lead. But looking back now, I wouldn't change a single moment, because the greatest relationships aren't built on perfect beginnings. They're built on honest hearts that finally find the courage to stop pretending.